The video series Detection and Lifestyle Monitoring was developed by the Georgia and Oklahoma Academies of Family Physicians as part of the Go Diabetes Initiative. The Detection and Lifestyle Monitoring series consists of 5 video vignettes, each outlining best practices in the care of diabetic patients. Please proceed to the registration page for more information on the approved number of prescribed credits for this activity as assigned by the American Academy of Family Physicians and AMA-PRA Category 1 credit as assigned by the Georgia Academy of Family Physicians. Upon completion of each video vignette, please return to the Resources video page on the Go Diabetes website to complete the activity evaluation and earn your CME. This activity is supported in part by an educational grant from Sanofi Aventis. We thank you for participating in this online activity and hope that it serves as a valuable educational tool.
The benefits of diagnosing people with the prediabetes or metabolic syndrome. Talk about these 7 trials. Reduction of 32 to 62% in relative risk from behavioral or pharmacologic interventions. To paraphrase that, you get a huge reduction in conversion to diabetes if you tell people to appropriately change their diet or if you start them on a medicine, especially like metformin. I personally start all my prediabetics on metformin. It is a little bit debatable as to whether or not that is the recommendation. Part of that depends on whether or not you think that they are realistically going to change their diet and exercise. You know, if you have a guy that lives on a farm and he eats at Kentucky Fried Chicken every day, that guy's not going to change. He's going on metformin. Now, somebody else who seems more motivated, you could argue for lifestyle changes first. But the point is you want to do something to prevent the conversion to full-blown diabetes, because the numbers needed to treat are only in the 4 to 14 range. That's a really small number if you're not familiar with that representation of statistics. It does not take very many people at all to get a benefit out of that. Yes, and for the people in the back that might not have heard that, if you start them on metformin, does that blur the diagnosis, the eventual diagnosis of diabetes? And the answer is yes, that if you suddenly control their A1Cs and they're dropping that down, absolutely. On the other hand, you're effectively preventing the actual diagnosis of diabetes in that point, okay? So if their A1C comes down because they're on metformin or they're losing weight, that's the point. It's exactly what we want it to do. So it does make it a little bit harder, but if they're still progressing to the point where they need other medicines or insulin, their A1Cs are going to eventually come up into diagnostic range no matter what, unless you're very proactive. So yeah, if they've never ever been over 6.5 on an A1C, but they're on Lantus and metformin, sulfonylureas and weight loss, and yeah, they may never have been technically diagnosed, but most people would agree that that's a full-blown diabetic at that point. So technicality aside, I'd still treat them. So then, cost-benefit analysis. Clearly favors diagnosis and intervention. There's 50 million pre-diabetics, 50 million people that we don't want to become diabetic. And then the main problem is obesity. It's quite simple, that diabetes is a preventable disease. But unfortunately, obesity rates are continuing to climb in America. So you deal with the abdominal obesity specifically, highest incidence of insulin resistance and glucose intolerance, and numerous studies tie weight loss to diabetes prevention. It's somewhat interesting that the only group that's actually been able to show reversal of diabetes is people in bariatric weight loss surgeries, okay? That otherwise, once you're labeled with full-blown diabetes, you will be the rest of your life, realistically. Okay, unless there is a colossal amount of weight loss that sometimes comes with those bariatric surgeries, they actually do convert over to a non-diabetic state. Otherwise, you have to target them in the pre-diabetic state. You can reverse that and effectively prevent them from ever becoming diabetic, but once they do, they always will be, excluding bariatric surgeries. Okay? 5 to 10% weight loss is a 58% reduction in the incidence of diabetes. So it's not about achieving any specific goal weight or a specific BMI, you have to start with something that's attainable and very specific to that person, okay? If they weigh 250 pounds, focus on a 25-pound weight loss, a 10% loss. Especially if they're still pre-diabetic, then at the end of 4 years, they have half the odds that they would have otherwise in being converted over to diabetes, even though they're still obese. Diet and exercise regimens average 4 kilogram loss after 2 years, whereas advice alone gets a 1 kilogram gain. And that's something that's worth paying attention to. If you say, hey, you need to lose weight, they're going to gain weight, all right? If you tell them, look, this is what you need to do with your carbs, this is what you need to do with your calorie intake, this, you know, I'm 6'3", that my calorie intake is going to be different than a classic 70 kilogram male. If you figure that out and say, this is what you need to eat, this is what you need to do, this is your exercise regimen. Yes, you have terrible osteoarthritis of the knees, but here is your exercise plan that's tailored for you. If you do all that, it does work. If you just leave it to them and their own devices, it's not going to work. And some of this will come up in our diabetic education talks too. So then quantifying it. Again, 40 inches for males, 35 inches for females. Some ethnic groups get kind of a little break there, different frameworks, especially Asian groups, 35 inches, 31 inches for Asians. You measure it across the iliac crest in case you really want to be specific on how you're measuring people's guts. Don't really care about that. Activity recommendations, general fitness, because that's another question that we frequently get is, well, how much exercise do I need to do? 30 minutes a day of moderate activity, 5 days a week is the basic recommendation for someone in a pre-diabetic state, okay? That can include what they do at work. If they're very active at work, that counts, all right? If there's someone who's just a receptionist or very stationary, they have to do something over and above their usual jobs and daily activities to try and head this off. If you're focusing on weight loss, now you're talking about 60 minutes a day. For children, it's the same. Now therein lies the problem, because you've seen a shift in the last 10 years where they actually cut back on recess for kids. You see a shift where they're cutting back on physical education and those kind of things. And that's a real problem. I think that's contributing to some of this epidemic in childhood. Fortunately, it's plateaued, that we've had higher and higher rates of childhood obesity and diabetes. That's actually plateaued a little bit, in part due to the nutrition guidelines and changes that they've made in schools for the lunches and vending machines and such. But the problem that really hasn't been addressed is the exercise and activity level. So it's something that you also have to have families aware that they have a lot of big kids. You know, these kids have to be outside doing exercise and things for 60 minutes a day if you realistically want to avoid having a 16-year-old who's a type 2 diabetic, because it's happening. Vigorous exercise, of course, has more cardio benefits. You know, getting your heart rate in a younger person over 180 and building up stamina and such has its purpose, but just for the purpose of heading off diabetes in a pre-diabetic state, not quite as relevant. So I hate to dissuade any people from exercising more intensely, but the point is they don't have to necessarily. You just want to focus on constant daily activity. And then the really interesting part of this is the concept of fitness. Again, people have a tendency to focus on, well, what's my target weight? You know, if you're 300 pounds, you lose 10% of your body weight, you weigh 270, which still makes you a big person. So, okay, well, what about fitness? If somebody is in shape and you're 270 pounds, but you can actually jog a mile, there are people that are skinny that can't do that, right? So a fit person who is overweight actually has the same overall all-cause risk reduction of somebody who's a little bit smaller, all right? That somebody who's small and is terribly out of shape has a higher rate of death, cardiovascular outcomes, and such. So focus on that 10% initial reduction in their weight and the activity levels, and don't have them harp so much on what the scale's actually reading. If they make the initial drop in weight and they're fit and maintaining activity, much less chance of heart attacks and such than a skinnier, sedentary person has.